Listen up. The Nazis built the biggest tank in history, 188 tons of steel and firepower, so massive it couldn't cross bridges, so heavy it needed 2 engines just to move. They called it the Mouse. The Mouse. Yeah, you heard that right. The heaviest tank ever made was named after one of the smallest animals on Earth. But here's the crazy part. They only built 2 of them, and neither one ever fired a shot in battle. By the time they were ready, Germany was already losing the war. So they did the only thing they could. They blew them up, destroyed their own creation to keep it out of enemy hands. Now you're probably thinking, why would anyone build something so big it was useless? And why name it the Mouse? And what happened to those 2 tanks? Well, I spent weeks digging through declassified documents, old photographs, and wartime reports to find out. And the story behind this mechanical monster is way more interesting than you'd think, because this wasn't just about building a big tank. This was about ego, desperation, and one man's obsession with creating the ultimate weapon, even when everyone around him knew it would never work. So buckle up, because we're about to explore the bizarre story of the Panzer VIII Mouse, the tank that was too big to fight. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1942. World War II is raging across Europe. Germany's been winning battles left and right with their Panzer tanks. These things are fast, powerful, and terrifying. The Allies are scared of them. But Hitler, he's not satisfied. He wants something bigger, something that will crush anything in its path, something that will make the enemy run just by looking at it. Enter Ferdinand Porsche. Yeah, the same Porsche that makes sports cars today. Back then, he was Hitler's favorite tank designer, and Hitler had a simple request. Build me the heaviest, most powerful tank ever created. Money's no object. Just make it happen. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most of Hitler's generals thought this was a terrible idea. They knew that World War II wasn't like World War I. This wasn't trench warfare where you could just park a massive gun somewhere and blast away. This was mobile warfare. Speed mattered. Being able to cross rivers and bridges mattered. Being able to transport your equipment by rail mattered. But Hitler didn't care. He was obsessed with size. He thought bigger was always better. And Porsche? Well, Porsche wanted to stay in Hitler's good graces. So he said yes. He'd build the biggest tank the world had ever seen. The project got the codename Mammut. That's German for mammoth, which makes sense, right? But later, they changed it to Mouse, the Mouse. And nobody really knows why. Some people think it was meant to be ironic. Others think it was a security measure to make the project sound less impressive if anyone found out about it. Imagine being a spy and reporting back that the Germans were working on a tank called Mouse. Your bosses would probably laugh at you. But there was nothing funny about what Porsche was designing. This thing was going to be a beast. Let me give you some numbers. The Mouse was going to be 33 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 12 feet tall. It would weigh 188 tons. That's almost 400,000 pounds. For comparison, modern main battle tanks weigh around 60 to 70 tons. The Mouse was almost 3 times heavier. It would have armor up to 9.4 inches thick. That's thicker than a phone book. Actually, that's thicker than 3 phone books stacked together. Nothing the Allies had could penetrate that armor. Not their anti-tank guns, not their tank shells, nothing. The Mouse would be basically invincible from the front. For weapons, it would carry a 190mm main gun. That's a 5-inch cannon, plus a secondary 75mm gun mounted alongside it, plus a machine gun for close defense. This thing could destroy any Allied tank from over a mile away, before the enemy even knew it was there. And here's the kicker. The designers wanted it to be able to cross rivers without using bridges, so they made it waterproof and gave it a snorkel system. The plan was for the Mouse to just roll into a river, drive along the bottom, and come out the other side. Because at 188 tons, you're not going to find many bridges that can support you. On paper, this thing sounded unstoppable. a rolling fortress that could take hits all day and destroy anything in its path. Hitler loved it. He was so excited he kept pushing Porsche to build it faster, make it bigger, add more guns, make the armor thicker. But there were problems, so many problems. First problem, weight. I know I already mentioned the mouse weighed 188 tons, but let me explain what that actually means. The average tank in World War II weighed maybe 30 to 40 tons. The famous German Tiger tank, which was already considered heavy, weighed 54 tons. The mouse was more than 3 times heavier than a Tiger. This created all sorts of issues. For starters, no existing engine was powerful enough to move this thing, so Porsche had to design a completely new propulsion system. He went with a gasoline-electric hybrid setup. Basically, a gasoline engine would power an electrical generator, which would then power electric motors connected to the tracks. It was the same system used in submarines. And it kind of worked. Kind of. The problem was the mouse needed 2 engines just to move. 2 massive Mercedes-Benz engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower. And even with all that power, the mouse could only go 8 miles per hour on roads. Off-road? Maybe 4 miles per hour. That's walking speed. You could literally walk faster than this tank could drive through a field. Compare that to the American Sherman tank, which could hit 30 miles per hour, or the Soviet T-34, which could do 35 miles per hour. The mouse was a turtle, a really, really heavy turtle. Second problem, transportation. How do you move a 188-ton tank? You can't just drive it across the country. It would break every road it drove on. The asphalt would literally crumble under its weight. And forget about driving it through cities. The mouse would collapse sewers, crush underground pipes, and probably cause buildings to crack from the ground vibrations. So you'd have to transport it by train, right? Well, here's the thing. The mouse was too big to fit on a standard railway car. It was too wide, so Porsche designed a special railway car just for the mouse. But even then, you couldn't transport it fully assembled. You'd have to remove the turret, ship the hull on one train car, and the turret on another, then reassemble everything once you got to your destination. And speaking of destinations, where exactly would you deploy this thing? Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. France, Italy, Russia, North Africa. Most of those places had terrible infrastructure. Dirt roads, damaged bridges, bombed out railways. Getting a mouse to the battlefield would be a logistical nightmare. You'd probably need a whole team of engineers just to scout a route that could handle the weight. Third problem, bridges. Remember how I said the mouse could cross rivers underwater? Well, that sounds cool in theory, but in practice it was incredibly difficult. First, you needed a river with a solid bottom. If the riverbed was mud or sand, the mouse would just sink and get stuck. Second, you needed another mouse on the other side of the river to provide electrical power through a cable, because when the first mouse went underwater, it had to shut down its engines to avoid flooding, so it ran on power from the second mouse until it got across. Oh, and did I mention the mouse crew would be sealed inside during this underwater crossing? Yeah. Imagine being buttoned up in a 188-ton steel box as it sinks to the bottom of a river and drives through pitch-black water. One leak and you're done. One mechanical failure and you're trapped. It's like a nightmare scenario, and all of this assumed you even had 2 mouse tanks in the same place at the same time, which, spoiler alert, they never did. Fourth problem, fuel consumption. Those 2 massive engines, they were incredibly thirsty. The mouse could burn through fuel at an alarming rate. We're talking less than a mile per gallon, maybe half a mile per gallon off-road, and Germany was already running low on fuel by 1943. They were using synthetic fuel made from coal because they couldn't get enough oil. The last thing they needed was a tank that drank fuel like a college student drinks beer. To put this in perspective, a mouse would need refueling after driving maybe 60 to 100 miles under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions didn't exist in World War II. Roads were bombed, supply lines were attacked, fuel trucks were destroyed. Getting fuel to the front lines was already a challenge. Now imagine trying to keep a gas-guzzling supertank supplied with enough fuel to actually be useful. It was impossible. Fifth problem, cost. Building the mouse was expensive, really expensive. Each one cost more than 10 Tiger tanks, and Germany was already stretched thin trying to produce enough regular tanks to fight on multiple fronts. Spending all that money and resources on 2 mouse tanks meant they couldn't build hundreds of regular tanks that would have been way more useful. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, knew this was a waste. He tried to cancel the project multiple times. He'd show Hitler the numbers, show him how they could build more Tigers, more Panthers, more assault guns with the same resources. But Hitler didn't want to hear it. He was convinced that 1 supertank could do the job of 10 regular tanks, which might sound logical until you remember that the supertank can only be in one place at a time. So despite all these problems, Porsche kept working on the mouse. He had to. Hitler wanted it, and when Hitler wanted something, you made it happen, even if it didn't make sense, even if everyone around you knew it was a bad idea. By 1943, Porsche's team had built a wooden mock-up of the mouse to show Hitler. Full size, complete with fake guns and everything. Hitler loved it. He walked around it, inspected every detail, and gave his approval to build real prototypes. Porsche must have felt relieved. His crazy project was actually going forward. But while Hitler was excited, the German military was nervous. Generals who actually understood tank warfare were looking at the mouse and shaking their heads. They knew this thing would never work in combat. It was too slow, too heavy, too expensive, and too complicated. But nobody wanted to tell Hitler he was wrong, so they just nodded and smiled and hoped the war would end before they had to use it. Meanwhile, the Soviets were pushing into Germany from the east. The Americans and British were pushing from the west. Germany was losing ground every day. Cities were being bombed, factories were being destroyed, and Porsche was still working on his super tank. By late 1943, the first mouse prototype was taking shape at the Krupp factory. This wasn't the final version. This was V1, the first test vehicle. It didn't have a turret yet, just the hull and the propulsion system, but it could move, barely. The first test drive happened in December 1943. They took the mouse out to a testing ground and tried to drive it around. It moved, slowly, really slowly. The tracks kept braking because of the weight. The engines overheated. The electrical system had problems. But hey, it moved. That was something. Porsche reported back to Hitler that the test was a success, which was kind of true if you ignore all the things that went wrong. Hitler was pleased. He wanted the second prototype finished as soon as possible, and he wanted production to start immediately after that. He was talking about building 150 mouse tanks. Can you imagine? Germany was already struggling to produce enough regular tanks, and Hitler wanted 150 super tanks that cost 10 times as much and used twice as much fuel. It was madness. But the war wasn't waiting for Porsche to work out the bugs. By 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. The Soviets were steamrolling through Poland. Germany was running out of time, running out of resources, and running out of soldiers. The last thing they needed was a tank that couldn't keep up with the war. Still, work continued on the mouse. The second prototype, V2, was being built with an actual turret and guns. This would be the full combat version, well as full combat as the mouse would ever get. V2 was completed in March 1945. By this point, Soviet troops were less than 100 miles from Berlin. The war was basically over. Germany had lost. Everyone knew it except Hitler, who was still giving orders from his bunker and talking about wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The mouse was supposed to be one of those wonder weapons, but it never got the chance to prove itself, because in April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the testing grounds where the two Maus prototypes were kept, German engineers received orders to destroy them. They didn't want the Soviets to capture the tanks. If the Soviets got their hands on the Maus, they could study it, reverse engineer it, maybe even build their own version. So the engineers wired the tanks with explosives and blew them up. V1 was destroyed completely, just twisted metal and broken parts. V2 was also destroyed, but not as thoroughly. The Soviets found it and managed to recover some pieces. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. The Soviets were fascinated by the mouse. They'd never seen anything like it. So they gathered up all the pieces they could find from both prototypes and shipped them back to Russia. Then they did something unexpected. They rebuilt one working mouse using parts from both V1 and V2. They took the hull from V1, the turret from V2, bolted them together and created a Frankenstein version of the mouse. Then they tested it, drove it around, fired the guns, tried to figure out if this thing would have been effective in combat. Their conclusion? Nope. The mouse was way too slow, way too heavy, and way too impractical. It might have been useful as a defensive weapon if you could park it somewhere and use it like a bunker. But as a mobile tank? Forget it. The Soviets learned everything they could from it and then stuck it in a museum. And that's where the mouse is today, in the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, the only surviving example of the heaviest tank ever built. Tourists can walk around it, take pictures, and wonder what the Germans were thinking. So what's the lesson here? Why did Germany waste so much time, money, and resources on a tank that never fought a single battle? Part of it was Hitler's obsession with super weapons. He truly believed that one amazing invention could change the course of the war. A rocket, a jet plane, a massive tank. He thought if Germany could just build something incredible enough, the Allies would be too scared to fight. It was magical thinking, and it cost Germany dearly. Part of it was Ferdinand Porsche trying to please his boss. Porsche was a brilliant engineer, but he was also ambitious. He wanted to build something that would cement his legacy. And he knew that saying no to Hitler was a good way to end up out of favor, or worse. So he built the mouse, even though he probably knew it wouldn't work. And part of it was just pure stubbornness. Once the project was started, it was hard to stop. Cancelling it would mean admitting it was a mistake, and nobody wanted to admit mistakes in Nazi Germany. So they kept going, kept building, kept pretending it was a good idea. But here's the thing. The mouse wasn't the only super weapon project that failed. Germany also wasted resources on the Ratti, an even bigger tank that was supposed to weigh 1,000 tons. It never got past the design stage. They built the V2 rocket, which was impressive, but didn't change the war's outcome. They developed jet fighters that were years ahead of the Allies, but they didn't have enough fuel or pilots to make them effective. All of these projects had the same problem. They were solutions to problems that didn't exist. Germany didn't need a 188-ton tank. They needed more regular tanks, more fuel, more soldiers, and better strategy. But Hitler was obsessed with spectacle, with intimidation, with building the biggest, baddest machines ever created, and it cost them the war. Now you might be wondering about the name. Why call this massive tank the Mouse? I mentioned earlier that nobody really knows for sure, but there are a few theories. Theory 1 is that it was ironic. German engineers had a sense of humor. Calling the biggest tank ever made the Mouse was funny. It was like calling a huge guy tiny or a bald guy curly. It was a joke. Theory 2 is that it was for secrecy. Code names are supposed to be non-descriptive. If you're working on a secret project, you don't want the name to give it away. So calling it Mouse instead of Mammoth or Behemoth or Dreadnought made it harder for enemy spies to figure out what it was. Theory 3 is that it was a reference to a German fable. In German folklore, there's a story about a lion who's scared of a mouse. The moral is that even the smallest creature can be dangerous to the biggest. Maybe Porsche was trying to be clever. Maybe he was saying that even though it's called mouse, it's still deadly. Or maybe he just thought it sounded cool. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that the mouse represents one of the biggest military blunders of World War II. It shows what happens when you let ego and obsession override common sense. It shows what happens when nobody is willing to tell the boss that his idea is bad. And it shows that bigger isn't always better. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that actually works, not the one that looks impressive on paper. The Maus had a top speed of 8 miles per hour. The Sherman tank could do 30. The Maus weighed 188 tons. The Sherman weighed 30 tons. The Maus cost as much as 10 Tigers. A Sherman cost about the same as 1 Tiger. Which one do you think was more effective in combat? The Americans built over 50,000 Sherman tanks during World War II. They weren't the best tanks. They weren't the biggest or the most powerful. But they were reliable, easy to repair, and most importantly, there were a lot of them. That's what won the war, not super weapons, just solid, practical equipment and lots of it. Germany could have learned that lesson, but they didn't. They kept chasing the idea of the perfect weapon instead of focusing on what actually worked. And it cost them everything. So when you look at that mouse sitting in the museum, remember that it's not just a tank. It's a monument to bad decision-making. It's a reminder that sometimes the most impressive-looking solution is actually the worst one. And maybe that's why the Soviets kept it. Not because they thought it was useful, but because it was a perfect example of how not to fight a war. The Maus project started in 1942 and ended in 1945. 3 years of work, thousands of man-hours, tons of steel and resources, 2 prototypes built, 0 combat missions completed, 0 enemy tanks destroyed, 0 contribution to the war effort. But hey, at least it looked cool, and that's really what the Maus was all about. Looking cool, impressing people, making Hitler feel like he was in control of something powerful. It wasn't about winning the war, it was about ego. Ferdinand Porsche survived the war, by the way. He was arrested by the Allies for war crimes, but was released after a couple of years. He went on to found the Porsche car company that we know today. So I guess things worked out for him. He got to build fast, sleek sports cars instead of slow, heavy tanks. Probably a better use of his talents. Hitler, of course, didn't survive. He killed himself in his bunker in April 1945, just as the Maus prototypes were being destroyed. He never got to see his super weapon in action. Which is probably for the best, because it would have disappointed him. The Germans destroyed the Maus to keep it out of enemy hands, but in a way, it didn't matter. The Allies already knew about it. They'd seen the reports. They knew Germany was working on super-heavy tanks, and they weren't worried, because they knew that a tank that can't move fast enough, can't cross bridges, and burns through fuel like crazy isn't a threat, it's a target. Imagine if the Maus had actually made it to combat. Picture this. You're a German tank commander, and you've just been assigned to the Maus. You climb into this massive steel beast, fire up the engines, and start rolling toward the front line. Except you're only moving at 8 miles per hour. It takes you all day to get there. By the time you arrive, the battle's already over. Your side lost. The enemy has moved on. Or maybe you do make it to the battle. You're sitting there in your Maus, basically invincible. Nothing can penetrate your armor. You're picking off enemy tanks left and right. But then you run out of fuel, and there's no fuel truck nearby because it got bombed, so now you're stuck. You can't move. You're just a big metal bunker. The enemy surrounds you, calls in an airstrike, and drops bombs on you until something breaks. Or maybe you try to cross a river using that underwater system. Everything's going fine until the cable connecting you to the second Maus breaks. Now you're stuck at the bottom of a river with no power. The crew has to abandon the tank and swim to the surface. The mouse is left behind, lost forever. These scenarios aren't made up. This is exactly what would have happened if the mouse had seen combat. It was doomed from the start. And the saddest part, Germany had engineers and designers who knew this. They knew the mouse was a bad idea, but they couldn't speak up, because in Nazi Germany, you didn't question Hitler. You did what you were told, even if it was stupid. There's a lesson there, a lesson about leadership, about listening to experts, about being willing to admit when you're wrong. Hitler wasn't willing to do any of that, and it's one of the reasons he lost the war. So what happened to the other pieces of the mouse that weren't recovered by the Soviets? Most of them were scrapped. After the war, Germany was in ruins. They needed steel to rebuild. So all those leftover tank parts, all those half-finished projects, they all got melted down and turned into something useful. The mouse was supposed to be the ultimate weapon, but it ended up as scrap metal. There's something poetic about that. This massive, over-engineered monster that was supposed to crush everything in its path ended up being crushed itself, not by enemy fire, but by its own creators, and then recycled. The legacy of the mouse lives on in weird ways. Tank enthusiasts and history buffs still talk about it. Model kit companies make scale replicas that you can build at home. Video game designers put it in World War II games, where it's usually overpowered and fun to play. In these games, the mouse is exactly what Hitler imagined: unstoppable, terrifying, perfect. But games aren't real life. In real life, the mouse was a failure, a very expensive, very heavy failure. And yet there's something fascinating about it. Maybe it's because the mouse represents ambition. Not smart ambition, but ambition nonetheless. Someone looked at the biggest tank in the world and said, I can make one bigger. And they did. It didn't work, but they did it. Or maybe it's because the mouse is so absurd. 188 tons. Named mouse, destroyed by its own creators. You can't make this stuff up. I think that's why people are still interested in the mouse 80 years later. It's a story that combines history, engineering, and human folly all in one package. It's a reminder that just because you can build something doesn't mean you should. So here we are at the end. The story of the Panzer VIII Mouse, the heaviest tank ever made. A tank so big it couldn't fight. A tank that took 3 years to build and 0 days to prove itself in combat. A tank that was blown up by the people who built it and then rebuilt by the people who captured it. A tank that now sits in a museum as a curiosity. What does it all mean? Maybe it means that war makes people do crazy things. Maybe it means that dictators with bad ideas are dangerous. Maybe it means that engineers should stand up to their bosses more often. Or maybe it just means that sometimes history is weird and fascinating and worth learning about. The mouse was a bad tank, but it's a great story, and that's worth something. Subscribe if you want more history that challenges what you think you know.